I was originally recommended One Dark Window as a good romantasy, and this was after I'd read quite a few of the popular romantasies available. I sort of found them underwhelming, which I discuss about why these romantasies don't generally work for me in this video over here. But suffice to say, I love fantasy, and I really like romance, and I love what each genre offers. Like in fantasy, you get that in-depth world building, you get that new speculative element that sort of like is engaging and we might be using to discuss something thematically that's happening in our real world in like a less contentious kind of way. And then I love romance because I love character building. I love relationships. So like combining the best of both of these genres sounds like my most perfect of all genre ever. But generally speaking, it seems like doing both the world building and this character building is too much to ask one author to do, especially in like this rushed release kind of era. So when I went into One Dark Window, I started taking notes and creating script to give you like a full longer conversation about whether or not it's any good and what it does or doesn't do well. And you can actually check out part 1 of that here. And something that would be very helpful to me is I have started putting together like part 2 of that sort of video, and I'm not actually sure if you guys even want that from me. So if you could comment down below on whether or not you're waiting for part 2 or whether or not I should just move on to other projects, that would really help me out. Recently, I have repeatedly heard people calling One Dark Window a gothic romance. And that struck me as something I would really love to examine on this channel because, as you guys know, I love everything gothic. And on this channel, we have 9 elements that could make a story gothic, and you only need 3 of them to qualify. And just off the top of my head, like impulsively, I would argue that at least book 1 of the Shepherd King series, One Dark Window, is not on its own gothic. But let's do a full evaluation, starting with elements of horror. No. There's not anything scary going on in One Dark Window in a traditional horror sense. There's not like a haunting or malevolent force or body horror. To be fair, if this is a gothic story, it's a gothic romance. So it not checking off the horror category is not actually that surprising. Usually there's something that's a little bit eerie or spooky in these gothic romances. It's kind of why you want a gothic romance, is to have that element of unnerving incorporated. But if you're not doing that, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not a gothic romance. And to be fair to people who are usually romance readers, they might see One Dark Window as having elements of horror because it does have a darker atmosphere and a much higher sense of danger and stakes than you usually see in these romantasy novels. I mean, our main character is living in a world where you get this fever and it gives you uncontrollable magic that's illegal to have. So when you get the fever, the government arrests you and burns you alive. That is dark. And also, if somehow you manage to evade the government and keep your powers secret, any use of them is not really controlled by you, and it always takes something from you to use those powers. So eventually you're going to die from like the lingering effects of magic. And I do think like in a better written novel that would have been really scary. But it seems like Rachel Gillig a little bit is still finding her footing on how to do all of this stuff in a way that has impact. And that's not me shading her as an author. It's very clear that she's trying. It's just that I don't think her final result is effective in the way that maybe she was hoping it would be. Something that's hampering my experience with the horror that I think Rachel Gillig's attempting to write is that our main character, Elspeth, had the fever as a child, successfully evaded the government, and supposedly doesn't have magic, but actually she's got like this other being sharing her head, and that's her form of magic, which she has had for 12 years now with no ill effects. So for the longest time, it feels like the rules just don't apply to her, which is like, do the rules apply at all? Or is this like a story people are telling us? And because all of these characters lack serious characterization when the degeneration starts happening to Elspeth, it's sort of confusing whether or not she's actually degenerating, why it took so long for her to be hit by the degeneration. And then like a me personal issue is Elspeth is really annoying and shallow to me. So her degenerating and possibly dying was something I was rooting for. Couldn't wait to get her off screen. Which rolls me into number 2, character is king, and I would give this a resounding fail. And to me, this is a huge issue because it's a gothic romance. Romance is about characters and their relationships, so if you don't have any characters, you kind of failed on this angle. To be fair, again, to Gillig, this book does a ton of world building, and I feel like we we sacrificed having actual moments of showing or experiencing things with characters for telling us stuff. And that might have even worked, except that we're getting it all from Elspeth's perspective. It's clear that her perspective has been compromised and makes her like a very unbelievable, unreliable narrator. I question how observant she is or isn't, whether or not she's interpreting cues correctly, all that kind of stuff. And because of that, I don't ever get a sense of these characters because you never showed me anything that like told me who they were. When you were telling me verbally who they were, it was from a character's point of view who I don't believe. And even then, I think what you told me was very shallow. Like, I don't have a good sense of who any of these characters are, what they want, what their goals are. A perfect example to me, the king wants to combine all of the Providence cards so that he can end the curse that's on his town. And the secret rebellion that Elspeth joins also wants to combine all of the Providence cards so they can end the curse that's on their town. They effectively want the same thing. But for some reason, the rebellion is cooler because you do have to sacrifice an individual to get this curse broken. And who they're gonna sacrifice is more humane than who the king wants to sacrifice. But like in Elspeth's case, since she doesn't know either of these people all that well at all anyways, like why does she even care? Why is the rebellion so much more noble to her than the king? Why does she trust the rebellion when she doesn't trust the king? I needed more internal motivation. I needed more examples or something to like make these actions make sense. Or like make me even feel investment in the plot or these character plights at all. That said, I do think there are moments of genuine chemistry between Elspeth and her love interest Raven. And in fact, I think Raven is one of the better like male love interests we get in these romantasy series because he is like emotionally available and self-aware and apologizes for things, acknowledges failures, and tries to do better. And we can see him like actively actually trying to attend someone's emotional needs, actually acknowledging when he like withheld information for no reason and trying to be more forthcoming in the future. We can see him like trying to make space for Elspeth to reveal things about herself or talk about her or like make her feel safe enough to do those things. But unfortunately, Elspeth is always withholding and always really private and quiet. And because of that, like we're not really getting the full one-to-one connection. So I don't really know why Raven is in love with Elspeth. I know why Elspeth loves Raven, but I don't know why the feeling is mutual, you know? Rolling me into more poetic prose. An attempt is made in these stylized epigraphs at the beginning of each one of these chapters. The problem here is I hate them. And they're pointless. And they're really stupid. In fact, I think even the author knew that they were pointless and stupid because they're not in book 2. At least so far. I'm only 25% of the way through that one. It's another instance where I feel like Gillig made superficial attempts to make something gothic or to make something artistic, but she didn't like really commit or go deep themes underpinning these aesthetic choices. Rolling me into elements of loneliness and longing, and this is the first time I can say yes, Gillig does manage this. Elspeth does keep everyone and everything at arm's reach, and it's because she shares her head with this other sort of like mischievous, slightly malevolent voice she's calling the nightmare, and no one else can know about the nightmare. But also, I think she's a little bit afraid that the nightmare will like harm them, because he does say like some nefarious or darker things, even about people that Elspeth loves and trusts implicitly. And I don't know if it's because the nightmare's trying to warn her off of these people, or if it's because the nightmare is just mean-spirited and likes to sow doubt. It's not very well identified in book 1, and even 20% into book 2, I still don't really understand why the nightmare did all those things in book 1. Like, I have a much better idea of who he is, what his goals are, but I don't know why he acted like that to Elspeth. And of course, Elspeth did have the fever, which is a thing she has to hide from everyone, and the fact that she does secretly have magic that no one else knows about, like, makes her have good reasoning for pushing people away beyond the nightmare. And her love interest, Raven, is also pretty isolated and lonely. He has a much healthier relationship with his immediate family than Elspeth has, and we can see that play out in how Raven is willing to trust people, how Raven does have a found family that he relies on and confides in, and even when Elspeth is giving this opportunity, she just doesn't. I found that frustrating, but it's not entirely her fault because she has all this extra baggage and trauma of rejection from her father, the loss of her mother. She's seen how quick people who are your family and are supposed to implicitly love you and stick by you will drop you like it's hot the moment you're inconvenient, which rolls me into elements of human mortality. And again, I would say no. We do come to find out at the end of this book that the nightmare thing that's been in Elspeth's head is actually the spirit of Shepherd King, which was sort of like an obvious signal pretty early in, but his spirit slash ghost reveal isn't until much later. But Shepherd King is not doing stereotypically ghostly things. He's not like haunting people. I guess he he is like an angry ghost out looking for revenge, but he's doing it in a way that I don't recognize as gothic, like in the slightest. And it certainly isn't giving like a focus on death or like the end. In book 2, we get a little bit more from Ghost, which might like better connect Shepherd King's spirit, what he's doing, why he's acting this way, to like some other ghostly figures. But here in book 1, where he is the only ghost slash spirit hanging around, and this seems to be like an unusual and terrifying thing even within this universe where magic exists and there's like an actual living god-like creature that's cursed their town, it does set us up for some things that could be like exploring a fate worse than death in book 2. But here in book 1, mortality of human being, the impermanence of life, it's just not explored, rolling me into the supernatural element, which I feel like I have to say yes on. It's a fantasy. There's magic and witches and surprise ghosts and gods and stuff. It's not really presented in what I would consider to be a gothic format, even though I feel like it should be. Like, for example, the one legal form of magic in this world is the Providence cards, which you tap 3 times to get a very specific effect, and you have to be careful because overuse will lead to very specific negative consequences, which on its face is a very gothic premise, like that alluring draw in and that repulsion at the same time. That sort of like love and good things, and then like at the same time danger and evil are all like combined in the one thing. Problem here is that the positive effects of the Providence cards are kind of meh, as are the ill effects. In fact, like half the time I'd say the ill effects are not that bad to good, and the positive effects are like, why would you ever need that thing? Compare it to a movie like Talk to Me, which I think is very gothic and horrific, right? There's this hand that the kids are using to like speak to the dead, but you can only use it for a limited amount of time before bad things will happen. It's kind of like a viral trend that the kids are doing. And then we get to our main character, who actually has a good reason to talk to the dead because she would like to see her deceased mother again. And that's what pushes her past the boundaries of the time limit and like instigates all the bad stuff happening. There's a legitimate push and pull there. We can see like teens and young kids doing something just for fun on a dare, but we also see why there's like deeper, more intense motivation that make things more sorrowful and horrific on the back end for our protagonist. The Providence cards do not have that in their draw or in their negative effects. So while it's superficially suggesting a gothic premise, it's not executing in that darker, deeper way. Questioning a character's mental health and reality? Yes. Elspeth is 100% an unreliable narrator. I do not trust that girl any further than I throw her, and I can't throw her half an inch. You know, I did take very thorough notes on the first book because I was planning to put together a deep dive for the whole book. All of my questions are like, do we trust her? Is this really what it is? Why would you feel this way? You know, I was consistently wondering how much influence the nightmare had over her, whether or not she was just a shell and the nightmare was the one who was really narrating the story to us. Because a lot of times Elspeth is scared of things or wary of things and she never gives us any reason why. She's like, prince is bad, the prince is bad, the prince is bad. Well, we're over 50% through the book before she actually gives us an example of a time the prince did something bad. I cannot just believe the prince is bad because you say so, especially because everyone else likes the prince. Seems like a you problem, girl, until you finally give me the example. Or she keeps asserting that Ione is a certain specific way, like she's very trusting, she's very open, she's naive. And as far as I can tell, even from Ione's own actions, that's not who she is. That's just who Elspeth thinks she is. We have no idea why Elspeth joined this rebellion. It makes no sense to me why she did that. Literally don't see a difference between the king and the rebellion. Now, if we come to find out the king never intends to combine all the Providence cards and remove the curse on Blunder, then there's a reason for the rebellion to exist. Although, based off of what the curse on Blunder is, I think eventually the impact is going to be so heavy the king is going to have to remove the curse because it will be too painful even for him to live under it. It's so clear to me that Raven is a guy that's trustworthy, that Elspeth in some ways has no choice but to confide in, and she doesn't. A lot of this is at the nightmare's bidding, you know? She does these things not because she feels this way or she has insight. She only does them because the nightmare wants her to withhold information or the nightmare wants her to tell people stuff. And like that inconsistency, that lack of cues that validate Elspeth's choices and perceptions means that like I have to question her the whole time we're reading this thing. And I don't actually know if this was intended on the author's part or not. I don't know know if I'm supposed to like disbelieve as strongly as I do, but at the end of the day, that was my experience. Is I don't trust this girl. I don't think she sees what's really going on. All the information she gives me is what she tells me and not like example based in reality. Rolling me into makes use of local folklore, superstition, and myth. Yes, even though this is 100% a constructed world, so it's not really basing it on our real world stuff, I do think the world building in the story is engaging and fairly strong. I like Blunder as a community. I like the spirit of the woods. I understand what's going on and why it's going on. I feel like I understood it way before the characters did, which was a little bit frustrating, but at the same time indicates like a clear explanation of the world that I can follow and make logical jumps with. And I would also say the mythology that's on display here is actually Gothic. Like the fact that there's a spirit of the woods that you have to pray to and that they give you powerful magic but they take horrific prices from you to get that stuff. The fact that eventually people turned to these Providence cards because it was safer and that made Spirit of the Woods angry and she cursed the whole town. The fact that you can get lost in this mist and be like consumed by the Spirit of the Woods. That is creepy Gothic stuff. It has that like allure drawing of the magic, the promise of something better, and then like a painful unexpected price to go with it. It's a little bit monkey's paw in that kind of way. And I think it's also doing a good job being mythology because they just have like this old book of rhymes or whatever and people's interpretation of it is different. They don't know like the literal actual truth. It seems like that truth might have been obscured. That's all kind of Gothic too, like in being really bookish and researchy and trying to like seek to uncover what the myth is trying to tell you, what the reality is beyond that myth. And then last but not least is strong sense of place, and I'm gonna have to say no to this. I really feel like this book tried very hard to make Raven's home the classic Gothic haunted house. It mentions 3 times in one chapter that this house is haunted, but we don't get any ghost stories out of this. We see nothing to indicate that it's actually haunted. And then on top of that too, when we have like classic haunted homes, isolated places in Gothic literature, even if we don't get to that place until part 2 of the book, it is a main central feature. This house like got no build up, we're just randomly there. It was another time where I was like, hey, this is a Gothic vibe, but there's no theming or building or substance there. The fact that it is a rambling old home and has a little bit of decay, but like we're not utilizing that to be meaningful is frustrating to me. So is this book Gothic? I think I actually have to say yes. The loneliness and longing, the makes use of folklore and myth, and the questioning of sanity makes this a 3-element tour. So it just gets in by the skin of its teeth. But is this a book that I would recommend as a Gothic read? Definitively no. I would say that so much of what's Gothic in this is aesthetics and vibes and like a Pinterest board and not really giving me those thematic depths that really bring me to Gothic literature. Does that mean One Dark Window is a bad story though? No, not at all. I think I rated this 4 stars when I was done reading it, which I was a little bit generous. I don't know if it has earned those 4 stars or if it's a 3-star read until I finish the duology because it leaves you a little bit on a cliffhanger. But I think there is a lot of good construction, thoughtful world building, and like intentional foreshadowing and payoff that Gillig does that shows that she's a decent writer. Even if this book is not like her best showcase of it, I would be really curious to see where Rachel Gillig is in like 5 to 6 years from now because I feel like she needs the extra time to cook and build and like storycraft. This is a good strong start, but I don't think that she'll really be hitting for me personally until a few more years down the road. But that's just my take on One Dark Window, its Gothic nature, and then I guess a brief hit on generally overall where Rachel Gillig is in her career. Talk to me in those comments down below. Have I been way too harsh or have I been too lenient? And if you've got a Gothic romance I should check out, recommend that in the comments down below because I would love some darker romance reads. And as always, keep reading.